December, this is crazy to say, is literally around the corner, and that means America Fest. From December 17th through 20th, every face in the conservative movement will be right here in Phoenix, Arizona. Okay, so let me tell you the tea. Charlie Kirk, Ali Stuckey, Candace Owens, Kayleigh McEnany, Tim Pool, and more. Musical guests, I'm talking full-blown concerts every single night by some of your favorite artists. Those have yet to be announced. It is the conservative party of the year. Last year, I was so blown away every day by the level of talent, the quality of every speaker and session. Also the fact that we could wear like really cute, casual kind of Western-y wear because it's like America Fest, right? It's like country music and all that. So overall, this is going to leave you feeling so amazing just being in a room with so many like-minded people. You're going to leave with new friends, memories, and inspiration. So consider yourself officially invited by yours truly. Just use code POPLITICS to get 25% off your purchase. Invite your friends, your coworkers, your entire family can come to this event. This is a family-friendly TPUSA event. And then get your tickets before they sell out. Listener discretion is advised. On Friday night, October 1st, 1993, 3 middle school girls were having a sleepover in Petaluma, California. Together, they shared secrets, ate ice cream, and tried on potential costumes for Halloween, which was just a few weeks away. Then, horrifically, out of nowhere, a bearded man armed with a knife came into the little girls' bedroom and told them that if they made any noise, he'd slit their throats. As the girls were crying, he tied them up and put pillowcases over their heads before disappearing into the middle of the night with the little girl who lived at the home he'd invaded. What ensued was 65 days of searching. Over 4,000 people looked tirelessly for the little girl until her body was found on December 4th, 1993. But the body they discovered wasn't just any little girl. It's never any little girl or any little boy because every missing child has a name. In this tragic case, the name of the missing little 12-year-old girl was Polly Klaas. Here today to share the story of Polly's life, her death, the rarity of stranger abductions, and how California's leniency with criminals contributed to the unfathomable outcome is Polly Klaas's dad, Marc Klaas, on The Spillover. We actually have a mutual friend, Mr. Klaas, and you may not be aware of this, but Mitzi Sanchez has been a guest on my podcast before.
Yeah, I know Missy really well. She's a great lady.
So great. And she had very, very nice things to say about you and just how you've really played a part in her life and now being an advocate for survivors and working with families that have had children abducted. So I just think that's incredible is that you have really had this whole story and touched so many lives. But there's a reason why you have been linked up with so many survivors like Mitzi Sanchez, and that's because you have your own story with your daughter, Polly. And this week, as this airs, is the 29th anniversary of Polly's death, I believe, this year. And so she would be in her early 40s if she was still alive today. Gen X is very familiar with this story. Millennials like me are very familiar with Polly's story. I was born in 1993. But now we have this whole new generation of young women, especially with Gen Z, who may not be familiar with Polly's story. And so before we get into her, everything that happened on October 1st of 93, I really wanted you to kind of paint the picture of what Polly's personality was like, what hobbies she was into, what was going on for Polly the 12 years before her death.
Well, she's in many ways been mythologized, but really Polly was just a darling, sweet little girl. She was so pretty. And I think that worked to her detriment ultimately. Well, no. I mean, things like that happen. You can be cursed by beauty, is what I believe, and I've seen that at various times in my career, most notably with Polly. She had a very outgoing personality. She had a difficult early life. I mean, her mother and I got divorced when she was about 3 years old. Her mother ended up with physical custody of Polly, but we had joint custody. And so there were never any custodial issues at all. Her mom was very cool. She gave me as much access as I wanted to my child, and she spent holidays with us and took vacations with us. She moved around a lot. It was only at the end, in the fifth, sixth, and seventh grades, that she actually was in one location long enough to really put down some roots and start to make friends. And, she was a slight girl. She was a very funny girl. She was an aspiring actress, and she was very, very good at that. It was kind of uncanny. She could pick up a script and do a cold read that would have all the nuance and emotion that you would expect out of a well-rehearsed script.
Well, yeah, and I'm also thinking, okay, early 90s, what shows was she into? What movies do you remember, or songs or anything?
Oh, God, I took her to some inappropriate movies. I can tell you who she really admired. She really admired Hillary Clinton, and she admired Sally Ride, who was
Interesting.
the first, I believe Sally was the first female astronaut.
Yeah.
She had great admiration for both of those people, and Winona Ryder, and she really loved Winona Ryder because she came from the same city, Petaluma, California. She had seen Winona around a few times, and she was, Winona's a beautiful woman and a very successful actress. So, those were kind of the people that inspired her, I think, at that time.
So on October 1st, when Polly was inviting some girls over to spend the night, were these girls that were regular friends of Polly's that your family knew really well, or were they brand new friends?
I didn't know any of the girls. I mean, she lived with her mom in Petaluma, and I lived in a town called Sausalito, still do, which is about 30 miles south of Petaluma, straight down the freeway. So I didn't know these girls, but I said that in the last couple of years, Polly had put her own social group together, and these were those girls. These were two of the three girlfriends that she spent most of her time with. And well, to get into it, that day, it started like any day, and I went through my normal routine. I got home at 6:16 p.m. I had about a 10-minute phone conversation with Polly. She was looking forward to coming and spending the day with us the next day, while her mother went down to drove south a couple of hours. And I remember the last thing I said to Polly was, "I love you." And she said, "I love you too, Daddy." And we then proceeded with our evening. Went to bed probably around 11 o'clock. We got a phone call from Polly's estranged stepfather at 11:30, almost matter-of-factly saying Polly's been kidnapped, and the police don't want you to come up here because they don't want a distraught father trampling on evidence.
That's what he said?
Yeah, that's exactly what he said.
And what was your reaction?
Well, I was much more concerned about what he had said previously, that Polly was kidnapped, than I was concerned about going up to Petaluma immediately. So what I did a couple of things immediately. I think the very, very first thing I did was call the Petaluma Police Department to try to confirm that my daughter had been kidnapped. And it took some minutes, but I was able to convince them that I was Polly's father, and they were able to confirm to me that there had been an incident. The second phone call I made was to the FBI, and I made that phone call because of the Lindbergh baby. I knew that the FBI was very involved in I think it was the 1932 kidnap and ultimate murder of aviation pioneer Charles Lindbergh's little baby boy. And I think that was probably the best thing that I did. I then spoke to Polly's mother. We had a welfare check from the local police. I think what they were really there for was to see if I had come and taken my kid, and that she might be in my home somewhere. And I was fine with all of that. And we stayed up. I mean, we didn't go to bed that night. And the next morning, we were listening to one of the local news radio stations at 6 o'clock, and they announced that a little girl named Polly Klaas had been kidnapped. And I knew that at that point I had to contact the members of my family one by one and tell them this dreaded news. Now, for context, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there had been a rash of kidnappings, of stranger abductions in the decade leading up to Polly's. And it seemed like every year there would be another child that would be kidnapped by a stranger. And none of those cases were ever resolved in any way, shape, or form. It was just unbelievable. They would be a big story for a few days, then they'd fall below the fold in the newspaper. Real old school media there, but that's what we had at the time.
My listeners, Mark, are very familiar with the Johnny Gosch case.
Okay, yeah, well, that was one of the first cases. So anyway, we went up to we called everybody. We went up to Petaluma. My wife and I went up to Petaluma and spent the next 2 months there. We never returned home. Mm. And I thought that, like so many of these other parents, I thought that I would be alone. And we were very fortunate. I mean, the town of Petaluma responded like very few towns had ever responded previously. I mean, we literally had people lined up around the block to check in and see what they might be able to do to help.
Over the course of the 2 months that Polly was missing, before you guys discovered her body, you had, is it correct, over 4,000 people were helping search for her?
Oh, yeah.
Which is incredible.
No question about that. Yeah, we had so many people. And I mean, truck drivers would regularly come by and pick up stacks of flyers to send to distribute on their routes. We had several pilots with airplanes that volunteered to do flyovers. I mean, there's vast amounts of unexplored territory up here, really, really acres and acres and miles of forest and things like that. So, I mean, that got off the ground very, very quickly, and we were able to organize that. Fortunately, we were able to organize that really quickly, and that helped with a couple of different things. There had been a very large media response when Polly was kidnapped. And when we arrived at Polly's house that Saturday morning after she had been kidnapped on Friday night, there were network satellite trucks all over the place. There must have been a half a dozen of them. And I'd been told that the person that took Polly had a beard, and I was looking around and I realized that absolutely everybody I was looking at had beards, and it just really, really freaked me out. A reporter came up to me and asked me if I'd be willing to do an interview. And I thought back on all those other cases that had been unresolved, and I refused it. I said, look, I don't want to be this week's entertainment. I'm just going to try to pursue this on my own. And then she said something kind of extraordinary. She said, I can get more attention for your child with 10 seconds on the evening news than you can get nailing missing child flyers on telephone poles in 100 years. And it immediately changed my perception of what we could offer each other. So I did her interview, and I don't think I ever turned down another interview.
So in that, Mark, in that first interview, were you coached by the FBI and a way to do that interview? Like, were you speaking to Polly? Were you speaking to her abductor?
No, I hadn't even met law enforcement by then. I hadn't met any of the officers involved in her case. This was just a spontaneous interview that we did going in, and ultimately they never gave me, instructions on how to do interviews. This was very much a time when people in my situation were choosing not to do that. And it was being recommended that people in my situation don't do interviews because you can't trust the person doing the interview. Mm-hmm. But like the lady that first interviewed me, Marty Uribes, said, is that I have children. I've covered these stories for the last decade. I want to be able to help. We're not trying to take advantage. We want to be able to help. And she was true to her word, as were all of them. So differently from other people, I started interviewing on a very regular basis. And because of the response was so good, and so many people had responded and continued to respond, it gave good visuals for the media to keep coming back.
Right. So before we get ahead, I do want to talk about that night and exactly the circumstances of what happened, because a lot of people listening have never heard.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about what happened during the sleepover?
I can tell you exactly what happened. So Polly was supposed to have 3 girlfriends over that evening. She'd gotten permission from her mom to do so. She had to clean up her room in order to get that permission. One of the girls showed up about 6 o'clock. One showed about 7:15. The third one wasn't able to make it because she was ill. And they had pizza. They played in Polly's room. They were playing a little board game called Perfect Match. They were doing each other's makeup. They were doing, I guess, what 12-year-old girls do. And at about 10 o'clock at night, 10:30, I guess, is when it was, Polly opened up her bedroom door. And I should point out, her mother was asleep in an adjoining bedroom. Polly opened her bedroom door, and there he was, this gruff, bearded, knife-wielding stranger. And he said, "If you make one noise, I'll slit your throats." Now, interestingly enough, Polly's girlfriends fully believed that this was a practical joke that she had put on to amuse them, because she really was into theater and she was really into practical jokes. And it was only after these girls were tied and had pillowcases put over their faces that they started to realize that there was something else going on. And then they were telling themselves, boy, are we going to have a story to tell at school on Monday? But then it turned into something far worse, because this guy told them to count to 1,000, and he kept Polly separate from them. And he said, "You count to 1,000 and everything will be fine. I'm only here for the money." And within about 10 minutes, the girls were able to extricate themselves from their bindings. And they went in and told Polly's mom that she'd been kidnapped, and she was obviously in disbelief. She made a 911 call while one of the girls went outside to see if she could find Polly. And she went out the back door. I mean, this is very brave for a little girl who's just been tied up. But she went out the back door. She looked around the yard. She made her way very close to the building, out to the street, which was completely silent, and there was nobody anywhere. And that's when she realized what had gone down. And she went back into the house and told Polly's mother that she's not there, while she was still on the phone with the police.
Why do you think he took Polly and none of the other girls?
Oh, I think he'd been stalking her. I think a couple of things. First of all, she was so pretty. I mean, she really drew your attention. And secondly, it was determined at trial that he had been stalking her for some period of time.
Like watching her at school?
We don't even know where. We know that she lived very near a couple of parks. One park in particular allowed public drinking. And it was a park that Polly pretty much went past almost every day when she was going to visit her friends or otherwise engaged in her life. And then the other park was just diagonally across the street from where she was. And there's evidence that this guy used to hang out at that park in a bench facing Polly's house, drinking booze out of a paper bag. It's just unbelievable. So
were there any clues left at the scene?
Yeah, there were some things. I mean, it was obvious that he had a rape kit, because he used that to tie the girls up. It was also ultimately obvious that he had a special contraption to tie Polly up and pull this hood over her face and blindfold her. And the police responded, and then they did everything they knew how to do. But again, there were not even any kidnap protocols at that time.
No Amber Alert yet, right?
No protocol. I mean, every time a child would be kidnapped, they would reinvent that wheel yet again. Every time. So a couple of things happened very early on. Because I had called the FBI, they showed up. And unlike most cases where the FBI would swoop in, they didn't try to take over this investigation. They said, we'll work with you on the investigation. So they very quickly organized the law enforcement response. But because there were no protocols, one of the things they did is they put an all points bulletin out about Polly having been kidnapped. And a stipulation on that APB was that this information was not for release to the media.
Was that a mistake?
It was an anti-Amber Alert, is what it was. They somehow felt that nobody should know that this child had been kidnapped. So they notified other agencies, but none of those agencies notified the deputies in patrol cars because they thought those frequencies, those radio frequencies, might be monitored by the press. Now, unfortunately, 2 deputies had an encounter with Polly's kidnapper on a private road an hour after she had been kidnapped.
Yes. So before we get to this part, after she had been missing for 48 hours, you got a phone call. What was it and what did they say?
Well, it was on, could have been Saturday night. It could have been that evening. I'm not sure. But we got a call from a little girl, and she said that she was Polly, and she said that she was being held captive in a Days Inn in Daly City, which is just one of the suburbs in the Bay Area here. And the person that answered that call at my house, because my wife and I weren't there, knew Polly very well, but I think he was so freaked out by that phone call that he didn't really ask a lot of questions before she said, I have to hang up now. And unfortunately, the FBI hadn't put a trap on that phone. So they sent out a huge contingent of law enforcement officials all over the Bay Area to check every Days Inn that they could find, to check every motel in this one area of the Bay Area on the peninsula, and ultimately realized that the whole thing was a hoax.
How was it a hoax? Because they did end up tracing the next call that came in, right?
Well, what they did is the next day, the FBI put a tracer on my telephone. And when that same child or same person called 1 week later, there was another person at my house watching the phone. And the first thing she did was ask her what poster is hanging above your bed at your dad's house. And it was a poster of an old TV character called Alf. But they, the person didn't know that. And so we knew it was a hoax, and they were able to trace a call back to a residence in yet another Bay Area city. And it turned out it was just some teenage girl thought she was having some fun. And there were no charges filed against her. Hopefully her parents gave her a really good talking to. So that was just a false alarm. And
yeah.
But back to the night she was kidnapped, this guy had driven her up onto this road, and it was a private road, and the homeowner became aware that this guy was on her property. She called the sheriff. The sheriff ultimately and reluctantly sent 2 deputies up to find out what was happening. The killer had driven his car into a ditch and couldn't get it out. And the deputies ultimately helped him pull his car out of the ditch and sent him on his way. His excuse for being there that he was that he was that he was sightseeing. But I mean, there was no view, there was no sights to see, and because they didn't know that there had been a kidnapping, they sent him on his way. So we spent 65 days looking for her.
Who is Dana Jaffe, and how is she connected to the case?
Well, Dana Jaffe's the homeowner. She's the lady that lived on that property. And she's the one that provided the big break. 2 months later, she came across the crime scene and realized that, this doesn't look good. There were just too many clues that pointed in a very, very bad direction.
Because the area that he claimed to be sightseeing, it was like this was like a farmhouse or something way out, right? It was like a long driveway, wooded driveway that he had driven down with Polly, and that's where the police had kind of found him, correct?
Well, he drove up the road, but then he turned onto her private road, which was also just a dirt road. And there was a sign on the fence that said no admittance, private property, no trespassing. That's what it said. And so she called the police, the sheriff a couple of months later, said, look, this might have something to do with Polly. You need to send somebody up here right now. They sent somebody up. The detective, the deputy immediately determined that something very bad was going on. They contacted the FBI. They contacted the Petaluma police. They finally did a check. They finally checked this guy's driver's license from the incident report of the night that the police first saw him, and realized that this guy spent most of his life in prison, that he'd been convicted of a couple of kidnappings, that he'd been diagnosed as a sexually sadistic psychopath, and ultimately made a pretty prompt arrest. And then he was prosecuted.
So what did you end up finding out after the fact of after he had abducted Polly from her mom's house? How long was she alive after that? What ended up happening in those hours?
We don't know. I mean, I think that she was dead when the deputies showed up that evening, because I don't think that she would have just kept quiet. She would have wanted, I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, she was a 12-year-old girl. This was her worst nightmare being realized, being taken in the middle of the night by the boogeyman. So I believe that had she been able to, she would have said something to the deputies. He claimed she was still alive, but I don't believe one word this guy says.
What was it that Dana Jaffe found on her property that she thought was weird that warranted her to call the police?
Well, she found the ties, the bindings. She found the device he had created to pull over her head that had makeup on the inside of it. There was the condom. There were some old dirty clothing. And those things together led her to believe that something terrible had happened to a child at that location. And it happened to be in very close proximity to the location where the deputies had talked to this character.
And you mentioned that investigators basically put together everything about the offender's record, and yet he was out free. Do you feel like California's soft on crime policies are partly to blame for the murder of your daughter?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there was no accountability for crime. This is a guy who had been he was a sex offender. He'd been previously arrested or convicted of kidnapping twice previously. He'd been diagnosed as a sexually sadistic psychopath. Think about that. Think about what that means. That's so abhorrent that somebody like that would ever be allowed to set foot in freedom. And it turned out that he wasn't the only one, and California wasn't the only place. I mean, the whole environment, crime environment back in those days was was rehabilitation, not incarceration. And to that end, because it saved on the front end, I guess, or on the back end, it saved so much money that they would regurgitate the same characters through the justice system time and time and time again. So a guy like Richard Allen Davis, the guy that kidnapped Polly, would be sent to prison with a 16-year sentence for kidnapping and pistol whipping a woman and stealing from her. But after serving only 50% of that time, he'd be back out onto the street.
Are there any states that are handling crimes against children really well, or does America as a whole?
No. Nobody's doing anything at this time. The best thing going is John Walsh's show, America's Most Wanted, because he would highlight some of these cases on his program. And there were no special considerations being taken for crimes against children, really. Sex offender registries were not public. Nobody had a right to know what offender lived in your neighborhood at all. So, it was a terrible situation, and it was a situation which spawned some very tough on crime legislation. I mean, it was policy that spawned very tough on crime legislation. The very first thing to come through was the 3 strikes law, and that was being promoted by another father from Southern California, whose own daughter had been murdered by a couple of offenders, a couple of guys who shouldn't have been in prison. So basically, what ended up happening there is this other guy, Mike Reynolds, and I, and Megan Kenka's mother a year or so later, and Amber Hagerman's parents a few years after that, started promoting a child safety agenda, a very heavy child safety agenda. And several things happened. First of all, I was very quickly invited to the White House by President Clinton. And he seemed to take a real liking to me and really helped me establish myself as an advocate for missing children. Took the issue very, very seriously. I talked the president into putting a 3 strikes statute into the crime bill that he ultimately introduced the next September. And it started to be a tough time for criminals. In California, we had a very tough 3 strikes bill, to the point that offenders were leaving the state.
Whoa.
They would leave California knowing that they had a better chance of getting away with the crimes almost any place but California. And one of the huge results is because of the advocacy that we were doing, because of the crime bill that the president signed, which did several things. It gave it put 100,000 cops on the street, 100,000 more cops. It instituted truth in sentencing laws and promoted or encouraged states to adopt truth in sentencing laws, making about a $10 billion pot of money available to states for their criminal justice activities if they did do truth in sentencing. And truth in sentencing is really simple. Truth in sentencing says that if you're sentenced to 10 years in prison, you have to serve 85% of that time behind bars. No early parole, no early outs. And then the third thing that piece of legislation did is it put $6.5 billion into a fund for at-risk youth, for things like after-school programs, things like early education programs, Head Start, things like that, so that the feeling being that kids from disadvantaged communities would have options other than falling into a life on the street. And what happened is that within 10 years, crime across America was cut in half. Across America, it's just absolutely unbelievable. I don't know that anything like it had ever happened before. But unfortunately, now we're going in an entirely different direction.
Right. And so this is what is incredible to me that I don't understand. So all of this happens. It seems like, okay, we're getting on the right track here. And then, and by the way, the offender gets the death penalty. However, in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom decided to implement a moratorium halting all executions. How do you feel about that?
Well, let me tell you how I feel about that. I don't know. I got to a point where I wasn't sure that this character would ever be executed because it had been over 20 years. It had been 23 years since he was convicted at that point. But I know that on the day of March 12th, 2019, I received a call from the governor's office, and they said that the governor wanted to talk to me the next day about crime victim equity. And would I be able to come up to the Capitol for this discussion? And as crime victims had been ignored for the previous several years, I said, yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to go there. And so I drove up to Sacramento, which is 100 miles from where I live, went into the meeting with Newsom and other people that I knew from the victims community. And as we were getting ready to wrap the meeting, he said, "Oh, there's one more thing." He said, "I'm going to declare a moratorium on the death penalty." I said, "What are you doing? You know that my daughter's killer's on death row." And he went into this whole convoluted statement about why he doesn't believe in the death penalty, and that as long as he's governor, they're not going to do it. And his excuses were the same tired excuses that I don't want to be the one to execute an innocent person. And I pointed out to him that his predecessor, Jerry Brown, was also an ultra liberal or a progressive or whatever you call these characters these days, who was also against the death penalty, but he insisted that everybody on death row deserved to be on death row. And Newsom didn't care. He wasn't listening. And the very next morning, he made what he said was, "I'm declaring a moratorium on the death penalty. I don't want to be the guy to execute 10 people a day for the rest of my administration. And I've talked to parents from both sides about this." And that's when I realized that Gavin Newsom had me drive 200 miles so he could tell me that he was giving a break, giving the gift of life to the guy that kidnapped, raped, and murdered my daughter. So I was livid. I was absolutely livid when I realized what this person had done.
I feel so much rage for you, Mr. Klaas. And I mean, this is...
Call me Mark.
That is one of the most disgusting, horrific, rude, disrespectful things I've ever heard. And I can't believe, that is a crazy story an experience that you had with Governor Newsom that I feel like news outlets, they should be talking about this. That is incredible.
Listen, he didn't legislate this. He didn't confer with anybody about this particularly. This was a unilateral decision to overturn the will of the people. Because whatever anybody says, the death penalty has always been popular in the state of California. And there had been numerous attempts to overturn it. They could never get what they needed legislatively. They'd put initiatives on the ballot that would constantly be defeated. Just 2 years before he took this move, there was an initiative to overturn the death penalty, which nobody was interested in. And there was an initiative to jumpstart the death penalty so that they could finally start executing some of these guys, because nobody had been executed for over 13 years in California, and that passed. So the people are very much behind that in the state of California. But this guy feels that his personal opinion is more valid and more important than the will of the people or the law of the land.
It's unfathomable to me to, like you said, look at a father of a child who's been murdered and say, I just feel uncomfortable taking someone's life, so to speak, when that person took an innocent life, which is your child.
So the next time you hear Gavin Newsom talking about compassion,
Yeah.
and he does that a lot. He does that a lot. He's a real compassionate fellow. Him.
So
He has compassion for serial killers, for baby killers, and for cop killers. That's who he has compassion for.
Never truer words have never been spoken, Marc. If you could say, so first of all, if there ever comes a day where your daughter's killer is executed, would you want to be in person for that execution or no?
With champagne.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't forgive. There is no forgiveness in my heart. And I know people say it time and time and time again, that if you're going to be able to lead a productive life, you have to forgive. You have to be able to forgive transgressions. But I've always thought there's a quote by a guy named Elie Wiesel. He was a Nazi hunter, a very famous Nazi hunter back in the day. And he said that you can forgive transgressions against yourself, but you cannot forgive transgressions that were committed against somebody else. And I mean, I'd heard preachers say, well, I forgive Adolf Hitler for the 13 million people he murdered in World War II. And I'm thinking, who are you, man? And that, to me, that quote, that you cannot forgive for transgressions committed against somebody else, resonated with me like almost nothing I've ever heard in my life. And I've been very, very comfortable in my disdain and hatred towards this guy and my desire to see him executed. I don't know that that'll ever happen. I suspect it probably won't, the way things are going these days. But I do believe that he should be sitting on death row. And I do believe that he should have the possibility of execution hanging over his head for every day for the rest of his life. He victimizes her every day. He said previously that he masturbates twice a day in prison thinking about victims of his old crimes. So,
He shows no remorse.
Oh, God, no. Not remorse. He takes pleasure. I mean, that's an admittance of pleasure at the heinous crimes he's committed. We put down a rabid dog, for goodness sake. What's the difference between this guy and a rabid dog, except he's got free will? And look at how he's chosen to exercise it. So I don't know.
What is it like knowing that you've helped so many other people's kids come home, but that your daughter is not coming home?
We knew that. And what we decided to do was we decided to pursue a child safety agenda that would create a legacy for Polly so that her death wouldn't be in vain. So that's why I'm able to sit and have these conversations about what went down with her, because I knew that I'd probably be doing that for the rest of my life. But I just felt that somebody had to prioritize these kinds of crimes, and there didn't seem to be anybody else doing it. So, if we've helped people, I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I hold that against nobody. And there's nothing you can do about the past. You have to get up every morning and find a way to move forward. You have to. That's what's going to destroy your life if you don't do that. If you decide to hide your pain in pills and booze, then that's the path of destruction. If you decide to pretend like nothing happened and go into denial, ultimately that's going to be another path to destruction. But if you try to build something and create meaning out of death and hope that you can use that experience to help somebody else, then that's what's enabled me to be able to after a long time. It took me 10 years. It took me 10 years of counseling and 10 years of accomplishment, 10 years of working ceaselessly towards these goals for me to be able to appreciate anything in life again.
So you started Klaas Kids in honor of Polly. Talk about what Klaas Kids does.
Well, Klaas Kids is in a little bit of transition now. The first decade of Klaas kids was basically devoted, or the first 15 years was devoted to legislation that would protect children, whether it be keeping monsters behind bars, whether it be an early alert system like the Amber Alert, or whether it be a sex offender registry, like one is able to do now. I mean, now you can go onto our website, Klaas Kids, and you can look up a registered sex offender in any state in the country. And we'll take you straight to the state's sex offender registry, and you can do that. When Polly was kidnapped, it was against the law to share that information with anybody, anywhere in America. So that's changed. Now there's an Amber Alert, so that if a child goes missing, there are protocols in place that enable the community to get that information out immediately. Things have rolled back on things like 3 strikes and on things like truth in sentencing. Those things barely even exist anymore, and it's because of progressive policies. Governors and legislatures believe that we've incarcerated too many people. They believe that incarceration is racist. They believe that what they do is they turn the boogeyman into the prosecutors, the cops, and the judges.
Mm.
It's all these poor guys. They just didn't get enough hugs by their dad when they were kids, but we shouldn't hold it against them for the rest of their lives. How dare these prosecutors, pursue a 3 strikes charge just because they've made a few mistakes in their life? How dare these judges sentence these guys to these long terms imprisonment, despite the very clear evidence that they would continue to do what they've been doing their entire lives anyway. So now we find ourselves with crime spiking again. In California, what they've done is that they've changed the meaning of crime. They've redefined crime so that the crimes you're looking at, the crimes you're comparing statistically today to the crimes you were comparing statistically to a decade ago are very different crimes. Certain felonies are now misdemeanors. A perfect example would be stealing. If you steal anything under $950 in a day, it's a misdemeanor in the state of California. So basically what's happened is we've had this rash of smash and grabs that is unabated over a long period of time. And they use technology to get groups together to go in and storm department stores and things and run, flash mobs that would go in and come out and that's where we're at now. And we're at a place where murder is going up. And it's all the same stuff.
Mark, maybe you should run for office in California.
No, not a chance. I mean, I'll tell you what, I'm right here in the middle. I'm not anywhere near this polarization. This thing that's going on in our country just kind of blows my mind right now.
Well, I think that you're just a common sense American. I think that's where most Americans fall politically, is just, okay, what's not crazy?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty normal.
Yeah. I suspect so. I just guess my circumstances are a little harsher than most people's,
Would you want an opportunity to say anything to your daughter's killer or no?
Oh, no. Because every word that's ever come out of his mouth has been a lie. For an example, when he was found guilty, there's 2 phases in a death penalty crime. There's the guilt phase and there's the penalty phase. When he was found guilty, as he was being removed from the courtroom, he stood up and looked right at me and put both middle fingers up.
I've seen that picture on Google. It's if you just type in his name or Polly's name, it comes up. That was to you?
Yeah, that was at me. And listen, when he was found guilty of when he was sentenced to die in the penalty phase, the judge said he could have something to say. And the judge said, Your Honor, I know I didn't rape that little girl because she said, don't do me like my dad.
Oh, brother.
So no, I've got nothing to say to him.
Yeah.
at all.
So for other parents who are really, really passionate about crimes against children and stopping the types of atrocities that happen to Polly, there are organizations obviously like yours, Klaas Kids. You said that you guys are changing things. So going forward, what are you guys going to be implementing that's different if people want to get involved or support your organization?
Yeah, well, I'd say for the first, like I said, the first 15 years was pretty much dedicated to legislation. And the last 13 years have been pretty much dedicated to search and rescue and human trafficking. And we've run a very aggressive campaign, very aggressive teams in both of those arenas. And now because of in large part because of social media, that's changing. When Polly was kidnapped, people spontaneously responded, and we were able to get search teams out, and we were able to do so many things to keep her story alive until it was ultimately solved, that what I wanted to do after that was to be able to affect something like that in any community in the country. So we hired somebody, a guy named Brad Dennis, and we said he had a lot of search and rescue experience. He had just retired from the Navy, and we said, make yourself available. We'll send you wherever you need to go to organize a community to be able to respond like Petaluma responded for Polly. And that was a model that worked for a long, long time. And things have changed yet again. Social media has altered that landscape once again. And now what you see is that kids go missing, particularly in predatory situations. Parents or somebody close to the family will immediately launch a Facebook page about that, and it will notify the community will be notified almost immediately that a child is missing, and they'll start searching on their own almost immediately when a child is searching. So to depend upon our model of waiting around for a week or days for somebody to come and organize you, we believe that this is a time when communities can organize themselves, and they just need some leadership. They need some direction, and that's what we're putting together now, so that these communities will be able to respond, and they'll be able to respond effectively. They'll be able to respond without getting into the way of the law enforcement investigation. And hopefully that will result in the quick rescue of kids, because we all know that if a child is going to be murdered as a result of an abduction, 74% of those kids are going to be dead within 3 hours. 88 or 98% of those kids are going to be dead within the first 24 hours. So when they say there's no time to lose, that's absolutely correct. There is no time to lose. So that's the direction we're heading for into the future, is being able to help as a resource rather than as necessarily as a facilitator.
Well, Marc, I just want to thank you for doing an exemplary job of just showing what an amazing father looks like. Even after your daughter's tragic death, just the fact that you've never stopped being a dad to Polly. And I hope that you realize that, and just how America has so much thanks to give you for all the work you've done for missing children over the years. And I hope that this next generation will learn about Polly and all the generations to come, and that people won't ever forget her. So thank you for coming on The Spillover.
Well, listen, Alex, thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
If you liked this episode, then go back and listen to Season 1, Episode 3 with Mitzi Sanchez. She was abducted at 8 years old and escaped her captor. She's very good friends with Marc Klaas. And you will also enjoy Season 1, Episode 11 with Kara Robinson Chamberlain, who was kidnapped from her friend's front yard as a teenager by a child serial killer and escaped. I am so appreciative of Marc Klaas for being an advocate for kids like Mitzi and Kara, even though he lost his own child. Every day there are children like Polly who go missing, some with media coverage, some without, that you have no idea about. If you're passionate about crimes against children, prevention, and advocacy, an organization I love, along with Klaas Kids, is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Another organization that I personally really like, and I've done training with them, is Darkness to Light. They're a nonprofit that trains adults on how to look for signs of sexual abuse in children, whether they're your own kids or just kids in your community. Their website is d2l.org. I'm very interested to know if this is your first time listening to The Spillover, or if you've listened before. Let us know what episode drew you in by leaving a 5-star review today and letting me know to support the show. Next week, we're talking to someone who's very famous on Twitter in the conservative movement. That's your hint. The Spillover drops every Thursday at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also watch every episode on the Politics YouTube channel or the Spillover page on Rumble. I'm Alex Clark, and this is The Spillover. Love you. Mean it. Bye.